The neighborhood of Willow Creek was the kind of place where people obsessed over the height of their fescue. Grass and the specific shade of beige allowed for shutters. It was quiet, affluent, and generally peaceful, until Evelyn Vance moved into the house directly across the street from Elias Thorne. Elias was a retired structural engineer who valued two things above all else: his precision-restored 1967 Mustang Fastback and his morning routine. Every day at 7:30 a.m., Elias would open his garage door, back the Mustang out with the care of a surgeon, and head to the local bakery for a fresh sourdough loaf. The trouble began 3 days after Evelyn, whom the neighborhood WhatsApp group had already dubbed Karen, due to her penchant for reporting, suspiciously long grass, arrived. Evelyn drove a pristine silver BMW X7. She didn't just drive it, she wielded it like a scepter. On a Tuesday morning, Elias opened his garage to find the silver beast parked perfectly perpendicular to his driveway. She wasn't in her own driveway, which was empty. She was on the narrow street, positioned so precisely sideways that Elias couldn't even swing the Mustang's nose out without clipping her. Passenger door. Elias, being a man of logic, walked across the street and knocked on her door. When she answered, he tipped an imaginary hat. "Morning," Elias said politely. "I think you might have forgotten to pull into your driveway. Your car is blocking my garage." Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, sipping from a mug that said "Boss Lady." She looked at the BMW, then back at Elias with an expression of practiced boredom. "The street is public property. Mr. Thorne, I find backing out of my own driveway to be a chore. It's much easier for me to pull away from the curb. Besides, I'm sure a man of your experience can maneuver around it." Elias kept his voice level. "There's about 4 inches of clearance, Evelyn. It's physically impossible." She shrugged and began to close the door. "Then I suppose you'll have to wait until I go to my Pilates class at noon." What Elias hoped was a one-time lapse in judgment became a daily ritual of spite. Every evening, Evelyn would wait until Elias returned from his errands, and then she would reposition her BMW. She didn't just park on the street, she parked sideways. She would pull her nose toward his curb and swing the rear out, effectively creating a silver barricade. Elias tried every civil avenue. He called the HOA, but they informed him that since it was a temporary parking situation on a public access road, their hands were tied unless she stayed there for more than 72 hours. He called the non-emergency police line, but by the time they arrived, Evelyn would move the car 6 inches, claiming she was in the process of leaving. The neighborhood watched from behind Currier and Ives' curtains. Sarah, a young mother from 3 doors down, stopped by Elias's porch one afternoon to offer her sympathies. "She's doing it on purpose, Elias," Sarah whispered. "I saw her yesterday. She waited by her window until she saw you putting on your coat. Then she ran out and moved the car, specifically to block you." Elias was genuinely baffled. "But why? I've never even spoken to the woman." Sarah explained that it was because Elias hadn't signed her petition to turn the cul-de-sac into a gated entry. Evelyn had told the HOA president that Elias was an obstruction to progress, and now she was making him the victim of his own obstruction. Elias felt a slow, cold heat rise in his chest. He was an engineer. He spent 40 years calculating load-bearing capacities and structural integrity. He didn't do shouting matches. He did solutions. The breaking point came on a Friday when Elias had a doctor's appointment for his hip that he couldn't miss. He walked out to find the BMW, positioned so tightly against his driveway that the bumper was actually hovering over his property line. He knocked, but there was no answer. He rang the bell and could see her through the side window, sitting on her sofa, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, made eye contact, and then deliberately looked back down at her screen. Elias missed his appointment. He spent that afternoon in his garage, not polishing the Mustang, but sketching on a piece of graph paper. He calculated angles, PSI, and depth. If Evelyn wanted to treat the space in front of his driveway as her personal playground, Elias would simply redefine the boundaries of that playground. The following Monday, a flatbed truck arrived at Elias's house. It carried 4 massive, industrial-grade steel bollards, the kind used in front of banks to stop ramming vehicles. Elias had spent the weekend pulling permits. Since the edge of the driveway apron was technically his property, He had the right to install architectural posts to prevent accidental encroachment. By noon, a crew was jackhammering. Evelyn came sprinting out of her house, her phone already in her hand, filming everything. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked over the noise of the drill. "You're ruining the aesthetic of the street. Those look like they belong in a prison." Elias, wearing a neon safety vest and holding a clipboard, didn't look up from his measurements. "Just protecting my property, Evelyn. I've noticed a lot of erratic driving lately. I'd hate for someone to accidentally veer onto my lawn," Evelyn screamed that she was calling the city. But Elias pointed to the stamped documents on his porch. "Permit number 4492. These are steel-reinforced, concrete-filled bollards sunk 6 feet into the ground. They're rated to stop a semi-truck. And the best part? I'm painting them a lovely caution yellow so no one can claim. They didn't see them. By Tuesday evening, the posts were in. They were 4 feet tall and spaced, perfectly to allow the Mustang to exit with 2 inches of clearance on either side. However, they were positioned so that no vehicle could park sideways across the mouth of the driveway without their bumper, being physically inside the strike zone of the posts. For 3 days, there was a Cold War. Evelyn parked her BMW in her own driveway, glaring at the yellow sentinels every time she left. The neighborhood was quiet, and people walked their dogs past Elias's house, giving him a quiet thumbs up. But Evelyn's ego was a volatile thing. She couldn't stand that he had won. On Saturday morning, the neighborhood was woken up by the high-pitched whine of a German engine being pushed to high RPMs. Elias was in his kitchen when he saw the silver blur. Evelyn was in her BMW, and she wasn't leaving for Pilates. She was performing a series of aggressive K-turns in the middle of the street, showing off how she could still maneuver around his stupid poles. She sped up, then braked hard, performing a bizarre, motorized dance of defiance. Elias walked to the front door, just as Evelyn decided to perform her pièce de résistance. She wanted to prove she could still park, sideways by threading the needle between the curb and his new posts. She swung the BMW around with a screech of tires, intending to slide into the narrow gap with inches to spare. But Evelyn wasn't an engineer. She hadn't accounted for the swing out of a long-wheelbase SUV as she whipped the steering wheel to the left to tuck the nose in. The rear passenger side of the BMW swung wide. Time seemed to slow down. Elias watched as the silver flank of the expensive vehicle met the first steel post. There was no crunch. It was a sound like a giant tuning fork being struck against an anvil. The steel post, anchored deep in concrete, didn't move a millimeter. The BMW, however, reacted violently. The side impact triggered the curtain airbags, which exploded in a cloud of white dust. The car's frame buckled instantly. The momentum of the car didn't stop. The SUV pivoted on the post, sliding the entire passenger side along the steel. It was a mechanical cheese grater. Doors were peeled back like sardine cans, and the B-pillar was crushed inward. Finally, the car came to a rest, tilted at a precarious angle, its engine hissing and its horn stuck in a continuous mournful blare. The silence that followed the crash was heavier than the noise. Elias stepped off his porch and walked slowly toward the wreckage. Evelyn was sitting in the driver's seat, staring through the fog of the deployed airbags. She wasn't hurt, but she was catatonic. She looked out the window at what used to be her pride and joy. The BMW X7 was now a silver L-shape. Elias stood by the first post, which had only a small scuff of silver paint on it. "You okay, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice genuinely concerned despite everything. She turned her head slowly, her hair a mess and white powder from the airbag on her nose. "My car," she whispered. "It's totaled." Elias nodded slowly. "Looks like it. Once the frame goes, the insurance company usually calls it a day." Within minutes, the neighborhood was out. The HOA president appeared, and even the mailman stopped his truck to stare. Evelyn climbed out of the driver's side, her legs shaking. Her shock quickly turned back into rage. "I'm suing you! These posts are a hazard. You intentionally caused this." Elias just pointed upward. "I have a ring camera, Evelyn. It shows you doing high-speed maneuvers in a residential zone. My posts were stationary. They didn't jump out at you." The police arrived shortly after. They didn't give Elias a citation, but they did give Evelyn a ticket for reckless driving. The BMW was towed away on a flatbed 3 hours later. looking like a piece of modern art titled Hubris. Evelyn moved out 2 months later, unable to handle the fact that no one in the neighborhood would look her in the eye without smirking. She sold her house to a lovely couple who asked Elias for gardening advice. On a warm Saturday morning, Elias backed his Mustang out of the garage. He paused at the end of the driveway, looking at the spot where the silver BMW used to sit. Elias shifted into first gear, feeling a sense of peace. He had realized that sometimes the only way to deal with an immovable object is to become one yourself. The yellow posts stood like silent guardians, and Elias finally had his morning back.